Taoiseach, it's hard to remember any time since the Good Friday Agreement when the political infrastructure of the north of Ireland was in such chaos. In the north today, there's 44,000 people who are on the housing waiting lists. There's 250,000 people on health waiting lists in the north for more than a year. That's 1 in 7 people in the north of Ireland. And 300,000 men, women and children are living in poverty in the north. There's a cost of living crisis engulfing families every day in the north of Ireland. And yet, at exactly the same time, the executive charged with fixing this is crashed. And that a government of any society that's dealing with such a confluence of crises would be suspended would not be tolerated in any other democracy in the world. And the truth of the matter is, Taoiseach, that the Good Friday Agreement has been gutted. The executive is not working whatsoever. And also, the North-South Ministerial Council, which was a significant reason for nationalists to support the Good Friday Agreement, is not working either. And there's no sign of resolution in this whatsoever. The DUP state that if nationalists hold the position of First Minister after the elections, they may not hold the position of Deputy First Minister. And shockingly, even after the people of the North get to say their democratic votes on the 5th of May, the DUP are stating that they may not return to any executive whatsoever. So now the DUP have about 8% of the vote in the island of Ireland. They're polling about 19% of the vote in the north of Ireland at the moment. Now, 85% of the population of Ireland's north and south voted for the Good Friday Agreement. Such an obvious violation of the democratic will of the people would not be tolerated in any other democracy on the planet. Right now in the streets, the UDA and the UVF are still active. Yet the British government officials are still meeting with them, and the DUP consider them stakeholders. And today, we learned that the Northern Secretary, Brandon Lewis, has said he won't bring forward an Irish language legislation in Westminster before May's Assembly election. Now, this Irish Language Act has been promised for 15 years. Indeed, Sinn Féin returned to Stormont in January 2020, after previously collapsing Stormont because they said they had achieved an Irish Language Act. In a combination of bad faith by London and naivety from Sinn Féin, we find out this morning that the commitment was hocus pocus all along. The British and Irish governments are co-guarantors to the Good Friday Agreement. Both governments are not co-guaranteeing anything at the moment. The Irish government is sitting on its hands, it's keeping its head down, and is hoping the crisis will go away. It cannot be ignored any longer, Taoiseach. You were in Washington 2 weeks ago. The White House is one of the few cards we have in terms of leverage to protect the Good Friday Agreement. What material help have you got from the White House to protect the Good Friday Agreement?
To take that question first, I think the White House has been, through the person of the President, President Biden, has been remarkably consistent, strong and assertive in relation to the Good Friday Agreement and the protection of the Good Friday Agreement. And again, in my meeting with President Biden, he was very strong on that. And I briefed the President on the current situation in Northern Ireland in respect of the executive and the fact that it was not operational, given what had happened, and that the elections were pending, and that, from our perspective, in the aftermath of these elections, a lot of work will be needed to restore the institutions. On the socio-economic front, on the political front, I've always been very consistent. The institutions should never be undermined and should never be collapsed by anybody or by any political party. If the people elect you to an assembly, the assembly and then to the executive, one should take their seats, take your position on the executive, discharge your duties on behalf of the people for the full duration of that cycle, that parliamentary cycle. And that, unfortunately, the history of the Good Friday Agreement and of the Assembly and the Executive is too often the default position has been to either withdraw for periods from the Executive, to collapse the Executive when different crisis emerges. And that, I think, has been a very significant problem in terms of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, which in turn then has weakened people's respect and esteem for the institutions. If you compare consistent surveys in terms of opinion of the Assembly versus the Scottish Assembly, there's a marked difference And I would put forward the basis for that is that in Scotland there hasn't been a similar interruption. The government is perceived to be working for its people. There has some more powers, I'll acknowledge, but in the north it's just been interrupted too much by collapse, and this recent collapse is unacceptable, shouldn't have happened, and is wrong for it to occur. We've been very consistent about that. And again, you know, the Irish Language Act, there have been numerous commitments at this stage. The Secretary of State did commit to Sinn Féin that he would bring it in the Westminster Parliament. It's, in my view, that promise should be fulfilled, because when agreements are made, agreements should be honoured. Now, we've been working extremely hard in endeavouring to create the right environment and framework for a resolution of the protocol issue, which stems from the Brexit issue. And Brexit, when it was passed, we accepted the decision of the British people, but no one properly thought through, particularly on the British government side, the implications of Brexit on the Good Friday Agreement itself or on relationships within the island of Ireland. The protocol was designed to be a resolution mechanism of those issues. And in our view, increasingly now the evidence is showing that the protocol, if you talk to Northern Ireland industry, business, farming, agriculture, the protocol is actually helping economic development in the north. And in particular in terms of potential foreign direct investment into the north. The signs are good, and in fact investment queries are increasing because of the fact that the protocol gives access to the European single market and to the UK market. And no one within Northern Ireland has said to us, we want to be cut off the European Union single market. And I met with Vice President Sefcovic in Washington. I had lunch with him, with Richie Neal from American Ireland Friends, again going through the efforts and initiatives of Vice President Sefcovic in relation to this issue.
I suppose, Taoiseach, let's be honest, the Good Friday Agreement is not being protected. The Good Friday Agreement is gutted at the moment, and it needs to be fixed, not with a stick and plaster to get it up and running with some pretend compromise that will never be implemented. The current arrangements are a recipe for dysfunction and instability, and the political institutions, I believe, in the north have to be reformed. I take your fine words in relation to the fact that the Stormont Assembly and Executive should never be collapsed. But what I want to know from you is, how do you stop it being collapsed? What the people of the north of Ireland want to know: how do you stop the Executive in the north being collapsed? The only way you can do that, Taoiseach, is through reforms of the political institutions in the north of Ireland. The North-South Ministerial Council is collapsed at the moment. That is illegal under a recent court case. There must be a penalty for that illegality. In relation to the situation, we have to change the law around the political institutions to prevent a party on 8% of the vote on the island of Ireland bringing down the institutions anymore. What steps will you take to make those reforms real?
I think in the first instance we have to deal with the agreement that we have. And yes, but there's an election on right now, and I don't think we should give any sense that whatever the outcome of the election, the status quo applies in terms of the election of the Executive First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Once that happens, once an Executive is established under the present electoral and political framework, by all means the parties in the north can engage in terms of whatever reforms people, just hear me out please, believe are desirable with the two governments. But in the first instance, there's an election on right now. We should allow that election take its course. We should allow the people to speak, election to the Assembly, and then the creation of the Executive.